The first time I saw him, it was raining, and the city streets were flooded with neon reflections from the streetlights and the billboards. He was standing under the corner of 5th and Main like he had nowhere to go, and everyone was invisible except me. I had just left work, my hands still carrying the smell of coffee and paper and deadlines, and he looked like he had stepped out of another world. One hand holding a tattered backpack, the other wrapped around a paper cup of something steaming. I hesitated before walking past, and then I heard him whisper something that made me stop. Did you ever feel like the world forgot you? I froze, and for a second I wondered if I should keep walking like everyone else did, like I had done so many times before. But something about the way he said it, something raw and quiet, pulled me back, and I crouched next to him under the dripping neon and asked his name. He said James and smiled a smile that was both shy and defiant, and in that instant I realized I was about to see the side of the city no one talks about, the side where people lived in abandoned apartments and slept in subway tunnels, and where the laughter of children was drowned by the hum of distant sirens. He told me stories of places I had walked past 1,000 times without seeing, the stories of strangers who survived on scraps of food and warmth in winter months that felt endless. I listened, and then I realized the clock had run past midnight. The rain had slowed, and I had forgotten the world above, street level, the offices, the restaurants, the people in suits who never saw the streets as we did. James asked if I wanted to see his world, and without thinking, I nodded. The next weeks changed everything. We walked through alleys that smelled of wet concrete and fried food, and the air was thick with stories of people who had nothing and yet held on to everything. He showed me a rooftop where pigeons nested, and the city looked like a glittering sea, and he told me about a girl named Leela who used to dance on that roof before she disappeared into the night. He introduced me to his friends who had names like Shadow and Patch, and they all had scars hidden beneath jackets and hoodies, and their eyes told me things words could not. We learned at each other's rhythms and secrets, and slowly I began to see the cracks in my own life, the lies I told myself about success and love and what mattered. I saw how blind I had been. The turning point came when the police came one night chasing someone who wasn't us, but everything felt wrong, and James pushed me behind a dumpster and whispered, "Stay still and don't make a sound," and I obeyed, my heart hammering like I would forget every lesson we had learned together. But I didn't. After they left, I realized I had been holding my breath for hours, and I exhaled, and James laughed, a quiet laugh that smelled of rain and freedom, and I understood that he had never really been hiding. He had been waiting for someone to notice him, and I had finally noticed. We spent the next months mapping the city together, learning where to hide from storms and where to find food, and where the lights were kindest, and how to survive nights when the cold seeped into your bones. He taught me to carry hope in my pockets like coins, and to give it away to people who looked lost and tired and forgotten. I watched him transform from a shadow into a guide, and realized that sometimes the people who seem most lost are the ones who teach you the most about finding yourself. And then one night we climbed to the highest rooftop overlooking the skyline, and James pointed to the horizon and said, "Do you see that light? That's the life waiting for everyone who dares to keep moving." And I knew he was right, because the city never slept, and neither did our hearts. The mornings were never easy, but James always woke before dawn and pulled me out of bed before I could protest. The streets were wet and silent except for the hum of distant traffic and the occasional honk of a taxi cab. We found a spot behind an old bakery where the windows were cracked and the smell of yeast still lingered, and we settled there for breakfast, scavenging leftover bread and apples from the corner store. James showed me how to break a loaf without making a sound, how to peel the apple so no one noticed. We sat side by side eating in silence, letting the world rush by, unaware of us, and somehow in that silence I felt alive for the first time in years. I began to understand that the city had its own rhythm, and the people who survived it learned to move like shadows, to listen to the wind and the footsteps of strangers, to understand when danger was near and when kindness could be found. We met a man named Eli who wore a coat that had seen too many winters and smelled of smoke and something sweet. He offered us advice and a place to rest during a storm, and James listened, carefully absorbing every word. We learned the value of quiet and trust and the art of disappearing into plain sight. The nights were the hardest because the cold cut through our jackets and the hunger gnawed at the edges of our patience. But James taught me songs and stories to keep the dark away, and I realized that sometimes survival was as much about imagination as it was about food or shelter. We explored abandoned buildings and forgotten subway tunnels that smelled of rust and damp paint, and I discovered that the city held secrets in its shadows, secrets that no guidebook could show, and secrets that only people like James could reveal. Each step we took together was a lesson in courage, in noticing details, in finding beauty in unexpected places, and I began to see the world differently. The people we met were broken in ways I could not begin to understand, and yet they smiled and shared and laughed and taught me that the heart could expand to hold even the smallest victories. The turning point came when James found a stray dog hiding in a corner, shaking and starving, and we spent hours coaxing it out, feeding it, brushing it, and watching it learn to trust again. It was a reminder that life was fragile and that sometimes you had to fight for it with everything you had. The city above us slept, oblivious to the lives being rebuilt in its shadows, and I realized that sometimes the people who seem invisible are actually the strongest and most alive of all. The days blended into each other, and I learned the subtle language of survival, how to read a street by the graffiti, the smells, the way the shadows fell across buildings. I learned that every alleyway had a story and every abandoned corner held a secret. The city was alive even when it seemed silent, and James was the one who taught me to listen. He showed me where to find water and where to avoid trouble, and how to move with confidence even when fear gripped my chest. We discovered a rooftop overlooking the skyline, and for the first time I felt a sense of freedom as the sun rose, painting the skyscrapers gold, and I realized that even in darkness there was beauty. There were nights when the sirens wailed and lights flashed across the walls, and I thought of the life I had lost and the people I had failed and the choices that had led me here. But James reminded me that the past could not dictate the future, that the strength we had now was ours to use, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving anyway. We met a group of kids our age who had chosen the streets because the world had failed them, and we shared stories and food and laughter, and suddenly I understood that we were not alone, that there was a community hidden in plain sight, and in that community we found hope and purpose. Every interaction, every glance, every moment of trust was a lesson in resilience, and I began to see that survival was not just about avoiding danger, but about creating connections and leaving small marks that mattered. We encountered a woman named Mara who ran a small library in the back of a boarded-up bookstore, and she taught us to read maps, to memorize faces, to tell stories that kept memories alive. She told me that every person has a spark that the world can try to extinguish, but if you nurture it, it can ignite change. And for the first time, I believed that even a life that seemed broken could create ripples The turning point came when a storm rolled through. The city, rain flooding the streets and wind rattling the metal shutters, and James and I were caught on a bridge trying to protect a small group of kids and a dog from the elements. We huddled together, and I realized that survival was not just about me or James, it was about everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, abandoned, and together we became a force, even in the midst of chaos. The next morning, the city streets glistened with rain and sunlight pierced through the clouds, and I felt a sense of triumph that I had never known before. I saw the resilience in the eyes of the kids, in the gratitude of the dog, in the quiet pride of James, and I understood that we had made a home where there had been none. The city continued to move around us, oblivious to the small victories in the shadows, but we carried them in our hearts, and I realized that even when the world seemed cruel, the connections we forged, the courage we found, and the love we shared were enough to create meaning and light. I no longer feared the nights because I knew that together we could face anything, and as I watched the skyline glow with the first light of dawn, I understood that survival was only the beginning, that life could be beautiful even in unexpected places, and that hope was the strongest force of all.